Right, so shall we look at some numbers that just reflect what we had before? So we're continuing with the example that we had before, and all we are suggesting now is the factor offers to collect debt for a fee of 0.75% of turnover. And they believe they will collect it over only 80 days. Admin savings of £20,000 are expected. So, all we're saying is, if we factor the debts, 1, we expect to save money because we can get rid of our own credit control. 2, yes, they're going to charge something for it. And 3, maybe they're more aggressive at collecting the debt than we are. And if that's the case, fantastic. We get our money more quickly, receivables balance falls. Whenever we look at these questions, we know that the fun part is always relating to the interest cost. So let's start with the interest cost and go from there. Interest cost. Well, if you think back, the sales were 10 million. And all of the debt will be collected by the factor. They said that they could collect it over 80 days, so we multiply by 80 over 365. And by doing so, we get our debtor balance. Once we've got our debtor balance, it's a simple case to then multiply by the interest rate. So our interest cost is very easy. We first of all calculate the debtor balance and then multiply by the interest rate, no more. Then we have our fee. Our fee is based on the turnover of 10 million, and we're told it's 0.75% or 0.0075. And finally, we've got our admin saving. The admin saving will be, well, I think we're told straightforwardly, 20,000. So all we want to do is to combine each of these in order to establish the net cost. So what do we get? If we look at the interest cost, this comes to something like 131,507. The fee, 75,000, and the admin saving, 20,000. The net cost, 186,507. Oh, so if we were to compare this against the original position, or definitely the cash position, we see that it's more expensive. But to a certain extent, I don't care about the end result. What I care about is that we pick up on doing the bits that we have to do well. We need receivables balance, interest rate, and hey, presto, we have the interest cost. So, we've looked at a little bit with regard to factoring. Please note that your examiner will tend again to talk about advantages and disadvantages. Debt factoring may be extremely useful for a small and fast-growing business. Because for a small and fast-growing business, A, they need the cash, and B, their own credit control may become overwhelmed. But debt factoring has a bad reputation. If you use a factor, it may suggest that your company is not doing very well. Also, your customers may not want to deal with the factor. They believe they were dealing with you, and then somebody else comes and chases them for the debt. You could also say that if you have an efficient credit control department in-house, it should be cheaper than an external debt factor. So you have to know your advantages and disadvantages. There's one other area that we could talk about here. We could talk about invoice discounting. Now, this confuses some people because, in the main, invoice discounting is offered by the debt factor. But it's not the same as debt factoring. Remember, debt factoring is where somebody else, the factor, collects the debt on your behalf. All that happens with invoice discounting is this. We look at our receivables balance as an asset. And given that it's an asset, we are able to borrow against that asset, using the asset as security. So, when we look at invoice discounting, borrowing against individual invoices. Now, of course, to make this worthwhile, the invoice has to be substantial, relatively large, and it has to be outstanding for a period of time. The great advantage of invoice discounting is simply this. What you're doing here is you're using your customer's credit status to borrow money. I think that is vital. You use your customer's credit status. So if you have a few very substantial invoices outstanding to high-quality customers, larger companies than you, you can take advantage of their credit status to borrow money. And it's a confidential service. It's a confidential service. Nobody needs to know about your secret. And that's all invoice discounting is, nothing more. Now, there are a few intricacies of how it works, but from a discussion point in the exam, I don't think that they're important. So, we've looked at receivables, a very popular area with the exam. We would expect a 6-marker very often in this area, either general discussion about receivables, or a bit of computation, or a bit of both. Okay, now let's look at managing inventory. Or if you wish, stock. When we look at managing inventory, remember it's a balancing act, as with everything in working capital. On the one hand, we need sufficient stock to operate the business in terms of, if you wish, raw materials, work in progress and finished goods. You could also argue that if you have a wider range of stock, particularly of finished goods, then you have more choice for the customer, which may help the business. But of course, holding stock costs money. The more stock you have, the more holding costs you have, and something we'll discuss. So when we look at managing inventory, there are two basic things that we want to talk about. We want to talk about the EOQ and play around with a few numbers. And also, we want to talk about just-in-time, very briefly indeed. Now, if we're looking at the economic order quantity, it is something that's already been examined at paper F2. And from that perspective, you would expect something a little bit more exciting to come up at this level. Having said that, your examiner has not ignored EOQ. It's come up again and again in the exam. So obviously he's vaguely interested in what's going on. What I like to do, before we do anything else, is just to understand the costs of stock. And to me, there are 4 of them. We have the holding cost. Holding costs include such things as warehousing staff, incremental insurance costs, obsolescence, deterioration, vermin damage. But by far the most important one is the opportunity cost of capital. The idea that we've got money tied up in stock that we could better use elsewhere. Then we have our ordering costs. These are the clerical costs of placing an order. The idea that every time an order needs to be placed, the purchasing department have to ring up the supplier. Goods reception have to receive the goods in and check them. And accounts payable have to pay for the goods. The idea behind this, them being clerical costs, is that the costs will be the same regardless of the size of the order. Then we have stock-out costs. Now, stock-out costs are the penalty costs of running out of stock. For example, if you run out of raw materials, you'll have idle time costs. If you run out of finished goods, you're unable to service your customers and you forego the contribution on lost sales. And then, of course, you have other issues, such as the loss of goodwill. If people cannot be delivered with the goods today, maybe they'll forego you the next time. And of course, if you're looking at your raw materials, we may have to replenish them quickly, and that will cost us more. And then finally, we have the purchase cost. Now, when we look at the EOQ model, the first thing we have to remember is this. The stock-out cost is not expected to occur during efficient operation. We assume we never run out of stock, which is a pretty hefty assumption and reminds us that this is a statistical relationship based on a number of assumptions. The other thing we could say is this. The purchase cost is assumed, at least to begin with, to be a constant. And therefore, if we're looking at the EOQ, the aim is to minimize the sum of the holding and ordering costs. So, let's just think about the basic relationship here. If we were looking at the holding cost, as the amount of units we order increases, let's say we order 100 units each time rather than 50. Will that lead to a higher or lower level of stock? Well, I suppose the deal is this. If we order 100 each time rather than 50, we have to have a warehouse that is able to cope with 100 rather than 50. Therefore, the larger the order quantity, the amount we order each time, the larger the holding cost. So, there is a direct relationship between the order quantity rising and the holding cost rising. If we were to look at the ordering cost, well, the ordering cost will be determined by the number of orders placed. And if you order more each time, presumably you need fewer orders each year. So, in this circumstance, if the order quantity rises, we would expect the ordering cost to fall. Well, okay, let's start with a simple example. And maybe this is not what you're expecting, but we will get there eventually. A company uses 1,000 kilos per month. It has ordering costs of $30 per order and incurs holding costs of $2 per unit per annum. required. If the company can order 400, 500, 600 or 700 kilos each time, which order quantity minimizes the costs? Now, what I'm trying to look at with this example is just to develop on our understanding, because I think we could very quickly just apply a formula, and we will be doing that. But I'm thinking that the template that arises from what we're seeing here is very useful, and that's really what I'm after. The first thing I want to highlight is that I've been a bit naughty. If you read the information that we have here, is there anything that's a bit confusing about what's going on? Well, the issue is this. Our usage is 1,000 kilos, but that's per month. Whereas the holding cost is $2, but that's per annum. And of course, it doesn't make sense to have this inconsistency. It's the only trick that the examiner can really play on you here. So make sure that you have everything over the same time period. And I think it makes sense here to make sure that the time period is 1 year. Now, we know that we're looking at 4 order quantities: 400, 500, 600 or 700. And what we want to do here is to establish the ordering cost and the holding cost, given that we have that. So, if that's the case, let's go away and just play around with the numbers, see what we can do. Well, okay, if we look at the annual demand, we said 1,000 kilos per month. That's what, 12,000 kilos per annum? And we've seen that the order quantities could be 400 or 500 or 600 or 700. Now, what I've done here is I've tried to look at things very simply. You don't necessarily have to go this simple, but I don't think it hurts in any way. What was it that determined the holding cost? Well, we know that the holding cost is £2 per unit per annum. But what we need there is the average stock that we're holding. And how do we get the average stock? Well, to get the average stock, all we do is we establish that when the goods come in, that we have the order quantity, and immediately before the next goods come in, we have nothing. So we're suggesting that the stock fluctuates consistently between the order quantity and 0. Therefore, we could say on average, the quantity will be Q divided by 2. Half of the order quantity. Then we could look at what determines our ordering cost. And of course, that is the number of orders placed. And the number of orders placed is going to be demand divided through by the order quantity, D divided by Q. So we've got these pieces of information. Couldn't we say the average stock is going to be half of 400, 200, half of 500, 250, half of 600, 300, and half of 700, 350. And then we look at the number of orders. Well, if the annual demand was 12,000 and the order quantity was 400, I believe that's 30 orders. 12,000 divided by 500, 24 orders. 12 divided by 600, 20 orders. And 12 divided by 700 is 17.14, of course. Please note, we have 0.14 of an order. It looks odd, but remember, the orders will run seamlessly from 1 year to the next, so it does make sense. In fact, it's important that you put the part order in. Now, that was just a simple working to help us out, to remind us of what's going on. So we've got those two pieces of information. Now what we can do is we can look at the holding cost and the ordering cost. And I'm hoping that this will be very straightforward. We know that the holding cost is $2 and the ordering cost is $30. And what we want to do is simply multiply these values by the information we have above. The holding cost will be determined by the average stock. 2 multiplied by 200, 400, 500, 600 and 700. And the ordering cost will be determined by the number of orders placed, multiplied by 30 and we get 900, 720, 600 and 514.2. Well, okay. We get this far. And what we see is that we have 1,300, 1220, 1,200 and 1214.2. Given that we've done the calculation here, we can see that the minimum cost of the 4 available, to be fair, is going to be at a point where the order quantity was 600. Interesting question, however. If we were just to look at the information at the bottom, here and here and here and here, could we say that the order quantity of 600 is necessarily the economic order quantity? Well, the answer is no. So let's just go away and think about the economic order quantity. Think about the relationship, and then we'll just come back and look at these numbers and see if we can say something a little bit more interesting. So, if we were to go away, what I want to do is I want to just sketch up the relationship that we were seeing. You see, what we're trying to do here is we're looking at the order quantity in relation to cost. And to keep it nice and simple, if we were to look at, say, the holding cost, we know that there is a direct relationship. What I mean by that is as the order quantity rises, the holding cost rises. If we were to look at the ordering cost, there is an inverse relationship. Something like that. And remember, the whole basis of the EOQ is this. What we're trying to do is to minimize the sum of the ordering and the holding cost. So what we're looking to do is to find some way of superimposing ordering on holding and minimize that value. And if that's the case, I won't hazard to draw it too beautifully, we find that the total cost, the sum of ordering and holding, will look something like that in the critical point. And most importantly, and I don't know how well I've drawn it, the key is that if this is the total cost, the economic order quantity is going to be that point there. Very importantly, I don't know if you've noticed, can you see this point here? The total cost, the sum of ordering and holding, happens to arise at the point at which the ordering and holding cost equates. So, if that's the case, let's just go back and look at the numbers we had before. Have you noticed that when we looked at this particular analysis, we said, yeah, that at the order quantity of 600, we minimize the cost. But maybe much more interestingly, what we find is this. That happens to be the point at which the holding and ordering cost equates. And therefore, yes, we know it's the economic order quantity. Well, okay. So we've just played around with numbers and established some sort of basic pro forma here. Of course, from this, we can now move on to what you're given in the exam. Because you're given the formula Q equals the square root of 2 cod over chips. There you go, joke of the day. fish and chips. And so all you have to do is to slam the numbers in there that you already know. So what we want to do is to take the square root of 2 multiplied by CO. CO is the cost of placing one order. I think we said that that was 30, didn't we? Multiplied by D. We said that demand was 1,000 kilos per month. We want it per annum to make sure that we're being comparative. 12,000 per annum. Divided through by CH, the cost of holding. But very importantly, the cost of holding 1 unit for the period. If we have the demand or usage for the year, we want the cost of holding for 1 year too. And as we already know, we have established this value. Q is 600 units. So, we have our economic order quantity. And we may be asked to calculate this sort of nonsense. Very importantly, we're able to calculate the cost of holding and the cost of ordering. If we just go back there for a moment. If you were to think about the way in which we've calculated the cost of holding, the holding cost, if you remember, was Q divided by 2, half of the order quantity, if you wish, multiplied by CH. And if you want to look at the cost of ordering, couldn't we say it was D, the demand, divided by Q? That gives you the number of orders per annum multiplied by CO. These maybe remind you of doing F2. Because in F2, these sort of things are heavily discussed for reasons I'm never quite sure. So, we've looked at some basic numbers. We've calculated the economic order quantity. Very importantly, we're able to establish the costs associated with ordering and holding. So what could your examiner do to make life a little bit more exciting? Well, let's just go back to the original premise. If we look at the original premise, we said that we had 4 costs. Stock-out costs we've got rid of because we assume that they will not arise, and that remains the case. But before, we suggested that the purchase cost remains constant. And of course, that doesn't have to be the case. So what we're now going to look at is a situation where the purchase cost may change. And in that circumstance, what we want to do is to minimize the sum of 3 costs. The holding and ordering costs, fine, as we did before, plus the purchase cost. So, what sort of thing could lead the purchase cost to change? Well, remember, we're looking at order quantity. And I suppose all we have to highlight is this. I think we all know that if we buy more of one item at one go, we tend to get it at a lower price. What may be described as a bulk or trade discount. As such, whenever we see a situation where there's a bulk or trade discount, we have to do this sort of analysis. Well, okay, let's put together some sort of Mickey Mouse example that allows us to develop on what we already know. A bulk discount is now offered for purchase of 1,000 kilos in one go. The price is $9.8 per kilo instead of the normal $10 per kilo. Required. Should we accept the bulk purchase discount. So it's exactly the same numbers as we had before. But this time we have a bulk purchase discount. And as such, our simple choice is we're either going to go for the economic order quantity, because that minimises holding and ordering costs, or we go for the point of bulk discount, because that minimises the purchase cost. To do this, we need a working, and that's precisely why we looked at this sort of working before, which of course can be used. Let's prepare the pro forma again, and this time try and understand precisely what's going in where. Well, okay, we've got our pro forma. We know that annual demand equals 12,000 kilos. And the two order quantities we could have are either 600, because remember that was the EOQ, or 1,000, because that was the point of bulk discount. And we don't have to, but we could do the sort of working we did before, just to make life a little bit easier. Because if you remember, the holding cost was determined by the average stock. And the ordering cost was determined by the number of orders per annum. To get the average stock, all we did here was to take the order quantity divided by 2. To get the number of orders, total demand divided by the order quantity. So it's not going to be too difficult. The average stock at the EOQ is going to be 300. The average stock at the bulk discount is going to be 500. The number of orders at the EOQ, 12,000 divided by 600, 20. At the point of bulk discount, 12,000 divided by 1,000, 12. So, all we have to do now is to establish the costs. We want to know the holding cost and the ordering cost. And once we've got our holding and ordering cost, remember the whole point here is that we must factor in the purchase cost. Now, if I may, we'll just stop here for a second. You see, when we look at these costs, I don't know if you appreciated this before, but the cost that we calculated was the holding cost for 1 year. Ordering cost, the cost that we calculated related to the number of orders for the year, that was also for 1 year. So not surprisingly, when we come to look at the purchase cost, we also want that one for 1 year as well. So, looking at our holding cost, we said that the holding cost was $2 per unit per annum. If we multiply by the value we have above, we end up with 600 and we end up with 1,000. Ordering cost, $30 per order. We end up with 600. But of course, we didn't need to do that because we know at the EOQ that holding and ordering costs are the same. 30 multiplied by 12, 360. Now, if we stop there, we know that the EOQ will be cheaper. The sum of holding and ordering costs at the EOQ must be lowest because that's what it shows us. So the issue is there any saving in terms of the holding and ordering costs going to outweigh maybe the greater costs associated with purchasing? So how many kilos did we purchase? Well, we purchased 12,000 kilos, and the purchase cost can either be $10 at the EOQ or $9.8 at the point of bulk discount. 12,000 kilos at $10 comes to 120,000. 12,000 kilos at $9.80 comes to 117,600. Therefore, our total cost is 121,200. Our total cost is 118,960. I think we see here that by adopting the bulk discount, we do benefit because the savings in the purchase price are considerably higher than the additional costs in the other costs. So, a little bit of EOQ, and your examiner loves playing with this, has done it a lot recently. The other side that the examiner may get excited about is to look at the idea of just in time. Now, we have to be careful here and wonder really what your examiner is going to talk about. Because just in time as a philosophy is really quite sophisticated, and there are lots of things that we could say. Therefore, when we look at just in time, what we're going to focus on is just in time supplier contracts. We're solely really looking at the relationship between us and our supplier. But before we do that, maybe we should just step back and think about what just-in-time is about. You see, the first thing about just-in-time is that it's a holistic approach. What I mean by this is we look at the whole factory performance. You could argue that the principle behind just-in-time is this. If this is the factory, what we want to do is to get through the factory from beginning to end in the shortest possible time with the least use of resource. Now, as a result of this holistic approach, we don't focus on individual departments or processes. We focus on it as a single entity, and anything that allows us to speed up the pace and minimize the resource must be a good thing. So, a holistic approach. Our basic aim is to eliminate inventory. Now, there are many arguments as to why we eliminate inventory, but the basic principle goes something like this. If the factory as a whole was truly efficient, it would not need inventory because we would be able to produce the product sufficiently quickly to fulfill the demand. The only reason why we hold inventory, according to just-in-time, is as a precaution because we are not as efficient as we should be. For example, if we could guarantee quality through the factory, we don't need any goods in finished goods. If, however, there is any quality failure that may arise, we need stock just in case. Or we could talk about production flexibility. If all staff were truly flexible in their skills, we would never have a production stoppage. If, however, there is some inflexibility, which means a stoppage could occur, we need stock just in case. And all of these arguments are the same. If we could try and eliminate the basic inefficiency, the examples we've got here are quality or lack of flexibility, then we need less or no stock. So, that's the just-in-time aspect. But what we want to do is to look at the relationship between us and the supplier. So, all I want to think about are the just-in-time supply contract issues. If I were to draw up a supply contract, what are the key issues that I would need from my supplier for this to work? Well, yes, of course, one aspect will be reliability. somewhere in the contract we're going to have to write into it that we expect them to deliver at a certain point in response to our demand. And they have to do it every time. They can't be hit and miss, because if we have adopted just in time and have no raw material stores, if they don't supply, our company stops work. Secondly, quality measures. Most just-in-time contracts have some sort of quality assurance deal. This is where the quality is guaranteed by the supplier. Because remember, if we don't have any stock and the component that is delivered is faulty, we can't do anything with it. We normally offer single supplier status. It is very common in just-in-time supply contracts for not just individual components to be sourced from an individual supplier, but for our supplier base to shrink to relatively few people supplying us, in order that we have a very close link between them and us. There is often clauses about new product development on the basis that if we expect them to do everything else for us in terms of reliability and quality, they best know what to develop well in advance. We would also expect close system links. It is often argued that in spite of the supplier being another company, they are closer to the factory entity than other parts of the same company. In essence, although they may be owned by somebody else, they are part of a very close-knit virtual company. So these are the sort of things that we would see within a just-in-time supply contract. It's always something that's worthwhile reading a little bit around. It's come up a fair bit in the past. There is always some chance that some discussion in this area could come up.